It's beginning to look a lot like Trenbolone.
Welcome back to episode 4 of the Force Velocity series. Today we are doing the next most upvoted sport that people kept asking for is MMA or mixed martial arts. So mixed martial arts is kind of a funny one. It's similar to CrossFit in its demands, and hence why huge amounts of anabolic performance enhancing drugs would be incredibly useful, as we'll see later. So today we're going to discuss a little bit about where the sport lies on the force velocity curve, and then what the training for that looks like. And as you'll see, it lies everywhere, which is unfortunate, but also very fortunate because training just gets very general.
Brief background. Hopefully you've watched the other 3 videos now at this point on the force velocity curve of kind of really high speed, low force, really high force, low speed being at opposite ends of the spectrum. MMA, or like UFC style fighting in general, does cover all of these. So you can say, like, you can pick any sport basically, right, and say, oh, it covers all aspects of the force velocity curve. You know, you could look at sprinting and find places in the sprint where really high force and low velocity happens. You know, just as someone is getting set up in the blocks, you could look at a rugby player and find multiple spots on the force velocity curve where they tend to train or where they need their certain requirements for them. But MMA is one of these ones where it really does throw itself all over the curve, you know. So you have striking, kicking, punching being very, very high velocity, almost no force movements. You're just throwing a fist, you're throwing your foot, you're throwing a heel or a knee. Then you get somewhere in the middle, which would be like takedowns, moving someone around while you're grappling. This is a very high power output piece, so it's like that speed, strength. It's a fair amount of force and you're moving the person quickly. And then you have the opposite end of the spectrum from what we first talked about, which is really high force, really low velocity. And this would be like holding on to someone while grappling, holding a certain position while grappling, forcing someone out of a position while grappling. All of these things kind of really spread themselves the entire way across. And when you look at certain skills that come into MMA, like defending a takedown, you then start to get meshing of the kind of really high power with the really high force. So it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting sport for you to pick us to do a video on, due to the fact that there are so many different demands for athletes to meet.
So if we break this down into kind of 4 different areas in terms of training, so we've got high force training, which would cover our kind of grappling, and then our muscular development, which kind of feeds into our injury prevention. And then we've got kind of our power stuff, which would be like this takedowns, and then we've our high velocity stuff, which would be our kind of related to our striking. So I'll start with the high force and muscular development kind of stuff and what that might look like, and then Fitz will take the high velocity and the power development training, what that would probably look like for MMA. So we have kind of 2 distinct areas where we'd need to be looking at high force, and that's just general strength training. So this is what we're kind of talking about, where you not really a specialist in everything, but if you could be phenomenal at everything, that would also be very good. For most people, however, unless your genetics are incredible and you're on a significant and very select amount of performance enhancing drugs, this is very, very difficult for you. So you've got a couple of different areas where you need to be as proficient as you possibly can. The issue with these is that we know that we have kind of negative feedback loops, or kind of vicious negative cycles between some of these. So if you're in a high velocity phase, when you're very, very fast, you're unlikely to be able to produce maximal force. You have only so much of an adaptation energy which you can kind of contribute to each one of these areas. Now, maintenance of each of these skills, the longer you have them, the more proficient you will be at maintaining these with the least amount of training, which is very, very useful. However, what we've seen and what we generally see is that most mixed martial arts athletes are very undertrained in all of these areas. So in one way, it's very easy for them to get better at this, but in the other way, it's very hard for them to maintain their gains in each one of these. So it's a very delicate balance. So if we start with the force, the high force training, and the kind of the muscular development, which would generally fall into that kind of top of that curve, so the high force near the top, we've just general strength training, like literally squats, deadlifts, benching, any kind of pressing, split squats, just normal strength training that anyone would basically be doing if they're looking for strength training. And then this will also feed then into our muscular development and our injury. Why do we need muscle? Well, muscles produce force. We need to train them in the right way, which will come into the other areas Fitz will get to. And then we have just muscle needed for stability, Strength training for high force is very good for tendon adaptation, increasing your tendons resilience, increasing your muscles resilience, your ability to resist high forces, i.e. someone hitting you or someone trying to pull you down, resisting their forces. So similar isometric forces, if you are resisting a takedown, resisting, you're in a lock, or if you're trying to resist guard or passing guard or something, you need to be very powerful in kind of an isometric fashion, but you still need to be really able to produce a lot of force to resist the power that someone is putting into you. So this is very, very useful. So general strength training is great for this tendon adaptation, developing muscles, resisting punches, taking less damage for punches. If you have more muscle in your leg and someone leg kicks you, or more muscle in your calf, you're more likely to not break your bone, like for example McGregor would have done. It also, high force training in general causes adaptations to bone. So it's like what you'd recommend for elderly women in general for osteoporosis. Strength training is very, very useful to increase the adaptations, and we know resistance training increases bone density, which is very important for fighters when both dealing out, fighting, and taking in. So resisting that kind of, all these forces, give it out, is very, very useful. So that looks like, you know, the very basic stuff, just normal strength training, and you've covered all your kind of grappling and muscle and injury prevention and muscle development in those two areas.
Moving on from that then, and you've the one in the middle, right, the power training. This is the videos of Wanderlei Silva swinging a sledgehammer. This is people throwing Wanderlei. But this is the people throwing a med ball against the wall. This is the hang power cleans. This is the jumping barbell squats, jumping hex bar deadlifts. All of these things are your power movements, right? The thing is, if the thing Gurf just talked about, the general strength training is taken care of, the power training an MMA athlete does or should be doing is very much a secondary thing. So if we take care of the ability to produce force, the ability to produce force in a well coordinated and well kind of structured manner, and then we make sure the system itself is quite resistant to intaking or taking in, as I think Gurf just referred to it. If you take care of all those things, your power training is a little add-on at the end of a periodized training block. It's the add-on of the last 3 or 4 weeks of your training before you go in and do specific, like before you have a fight basically. So maybe 5 weeks out from a fight, you would start a 4-week power training block. You would be at your most powerful probably a week or 10 days out from your fight. This power training, if you don't have a sledgehammer or a giant tire or maybe some chains that you could throw around to look extra macho when they're videoing you, that should look like 60 to 80% of 1RM on normal barbell movements that you're used to doing, and you should be moving that bar as fast as you possibly can. So this would be your bench press. Ideally you would have a dynamometer. Ideally you would have a linear speed transducer on the bar, so it would tell you how fast the bar is moving. You would move that bar as fast as you possibly can. For most athletes who aren't directly strength training athletes, you'll find it's much closer to 60% of 1RM. It's where you have your most effective power training kind of butter zone there. And then you do your bench presses like that, you do your squats like that, you do your deadlifts like that, and then you could choose another movement. You might do a push press or something like that. It doesn't necessarily have to be this kind of huge, dynamic, multi-joint motion. Just your normal movements you have been doing for your strength training. You just bring it to a slightly different bracket of resistance and a bracket of load, and then ensure you're moving it as quickly as you possibly can, and you start getting into power training. In the same way, power training is significantly different, although not hugely different, from our strength training. Our speed training is significantly different, although not hugely different from power training. What speed training should look like is you should be moving as fast as you possibly can. Whatever the movement is, whether it's a very, very light med ball throw to the side, whether it's a shot put style throw out in front, whether it's something like an over the top throw over the back, or whether it's actually sprint training, actually jump training, bipedal plyometrics, whatever it is, you should be doing it as quickly as you possibly can. So you need to think about a punch or a strike being you simply throwing a hand to there. Once I make contact with Gurf's face, my hand doesn't really, I don't contract my muscles actively when I'm making that contact to make that punch more hard or more kind of hard hitting than it would have been. The punch realistically is thrown from back here. Ideally, my elbow will lock out just at the point where I'm hitting or around that point, and all of the force is being transferred into the jaw, the liver, wherever it is. It's not a real force thing where I want to be pushing punches hard or really driving punches hard. You want to be able to throw the punch, throw the kick, throw the knee as quickly as possible. And therefore, when we're training the punch, the kick, the knee, the heel, whatever it is, you do that as quickly as you humanly can.
Also, on top of all that, then outside of the force velocity curve, we would just have high levels of you'd require high levels of a lot of conditioning, so a lot of steady state stuff to bring up your base capacity, and then you'd have a lot of high intensity interval training, which would be very useful to replicate those rounds. So you need a little bit of both of these. So you need to balance all of these. Also do your power training, your velocity training. You also need to be doing your sport specific training. You also need to be your force training. You need to be doing your hypertrophy training. So I know I said kind of tongue in cheek at the start, that's why we would need to be using performance enhancing drugs, but again, it's something we do, want to point out when there is a certain element at play, and we see these elite MMA fighters, and I know we've seen a little bit of decline since WADA. It became in, for example, in the USC, one of the biggest ones, although places like Pancreas, for example, actively said they wouldn't test athletes for performance enhancing drugs. I know Bellator are pretty lax with their performance enhancing testing. Thank God is right. So it was tongue in cheek, but just understand, if you are an amateur or you're an amateur that's not performance enhanced in this particular sport, it is very important to understand, just like when we talk about CrossFit, that of all sports, when you're trying to bring up everything, it's so hard to do it without a lot of performance enhancing drugs if you're trying to get to that elite level. Because like we know, grappling, for example, when Zach was on the podcast, is incredibly dirty. The drug testing is minimal, probably ineffective, I would say. So it's just kind of a fact of the matter is that this sport, like CrossFit, is almost a requirement at the elite level for performance enhancing drugs. For example, with weightlifting, we can do weightlifting, but just less of it without drugs and make progress. We can do sprinting, but just less of it without drugs and make progress. For these kind of things, to get to kind of like a very high level, drugs are almost, I would say, nearly a prerequisite, and not that we like to harp on about drugs, but when it's kind of really a big part of the equation, it's just important to understand that how are they so powerful, but in incredible shape, but really lean and pretty jacked and fitting into like 70 kilos, So when you're looking at them, it's just important to understand that's kind of why they're ending up that way. Now, you as an amateur who's not performance enhanced can certainly do all these qualities, but just understand that the magnitude that you'll get to with those is significantly less. Even the smallest amount of performance enhancing drugs would make to that. So
I think one of the most important things, if you are that amateur that Gerf is talking about,
take drugs.
No, if you are in that position, right, and you really love your sport, you obviously want to get better at your sport. You're obviously looking to learn something about it. If you're watching two idiots like us talking about it, in my opinion, one of the key things would be a well periodized training block, and that would be, I understand for this time of year I'm really going to focus on that. For this time of year I'm really going to focus on that. Plan things out for more than 10 weeks or 12 weeks. Like, have your year planned out where these 4 months, this 2 months, these 4 months, this 2 months, and go through your year like that. Like, just write out in your calendar what it's going to be. Have a broad scope plan, like know the way broadly, and then every time you come to a new 4 month block, say, okay, this is really what I need to focus on. This is what I really need to research. This is the body mass change I'm going to make. This is the difference I want to see on my speed meter, and this is the difference I want to see on the barbell at the end of the month. Like, you really have to plan so much. Powerlifting, right? On the 1st of January, every powerlifter in the world is going to say, I want a bigger squat, I want a bigger deadlift, and I want a bigger bench press. And most of them are going to want to be in better shape when they do it. That's very, very simple to move towards. It's very hard to mess that up, even though you can. You can certainly not get there as quickly. But most of the time, you're going to be able to just get stronger by the end of the year. In an MMA context, you can try and juggle all those balls and keep everything in the air for so long that you'll end up inevitably dropping one ball, and that one thing might be cardiovascular conditioning. You go then into a camp and you go to a fight, and your fight turns out terribly because although you're powerful, you're strong, you're moving very, very quickly, your conditioning is terrible and you're not able to finish the 5 rounds or whatever it is.
Just to emphasize as well and point out that the individual sports that mixed martial arts incorporate, so wrestling, judo, striking, all of these can be done very, very well. Again, you get to decent levels without the performance enhancing drugs. It's just anytime we get into a realm where we're trying to bring up absolutely everything and have everything at a peak value, that the lack of performance enhancing drugs is the detriment to being the best you could possibly be, in terms of it's just an unenhanced body is so opposed to having all of these qualities heightened that the lack of performance drugs makes it very, very difficult to be that, to get to such a high level, you know, to be super powerful and so jacked and so lean and so conditioned. And you even see in their cases they don't have it because they still, let's say we saw someone like who's that really curly haired fella who was very good at jiu-jitsu, and he fought your man Logan Paul or Jake Paul the other day, a few weeks ago.
I don't know.
He came in from jiu-jitsu, very high quality jiu-jitsu, but just not very good at striking. And I don't know if he's using performance enhancing drugs or whatever, but you see in that scenario he just wasn't able to pick up those sport specific skills. So even in those scenarios it's so difficult. So mixed martial arts, a kind of a crazy one to be trying to describe in the force velocity curve and describe training for, but for other sports, individual, which we'll get to eventually, it's a different story, and it could be a lot more productive.
In terms of the other sports and the other videos and all that good stuff that's happening, we've gotten a lot of votes for basketball so far, so it's looking like basketball is going to be right up there in terms of the next videos we do.
Yeah.
But this series is 100% decided by ye. So if you could get working in the comments down below, start abusing each other, we always love to see a bit of controversy. And that'll be great. That'll inform what video we want next.
And don't forget our 10-week combat sports programs came out a couple of weeks ago. People are having phenomenal results from it. They're having a really great time with it, developing strength, hitting PBs only after a couple of weeks, because they're just not used to a structured strength training program with power at the end of it. So 6 weeks of strength training, 4 weeks of power development. It's 10 weeks in total, 4 sessions a week. It's very, very useful for any of our combat sports athletes. It's just basic hard training with some good power development at the end, and if people do well with it and they like it, we'll definitely look for a part 2 for that if people are enjoying it.